today's series, tonight, Conservatory Director Josh Hamrick will speak about the artworks in the exhibit. After the gallery walk, please join us in the Virginia Van Zandt Hall for a light reception. And will you please join me in welcoming Josh?
Thank you. All right. First off, In His Nature, interesting title for an exhibition, especially of botanical prints, I think. Really that's saying in his nature, Dr. Marion Korstanje's nature, but also in his nature, big guy upstairs. We know Dr. Korstanje was a religious man to some extent, and as I start talking about these, a lot of the scientific inquiry that went into creating these works is really about understanding creation more, understanding our nature more. So there's a lot of Dutch influence in this collection. This is not the end-all, be-all for botanical art. Botanical prints started much, much earlier. In the Far East, in China and Japan, they were doing their own botanical art, their own school of art. The Middle East had its own school of art, and this Western school of art really kind of comes into its prime during the Dutch Golden Age, okay? So to get started, we have 3 selections here by, Bessler's a German, but there's 2 Dutch prints here. This collection's been shown multiple times. There's a lot of animal prints, a lot of bird prints by Audubon, and then a good number of botanical prints. And usually the curatorial department would look to the conservatory to kind of pick a few selections for the exhibition. But in this time, I chose all 40 of these prints, except for this one, the Bessler print over here. And curatorial had already picked that one out for the postcard and said, okay, you can pick the other 39. But it is a really nice, wonderful print. It's very beautiful. Bessler is known for publishing a work that had many, many, many illustrations in it, and they're wonderfully colored. So important stuff. But I want to talk about some of the others that haven't been shown before or not as much. So these 2 are by Crispin de Passe. And he is a Dutch engraver that was part of a family of engravers. His father, Crispin de Passe the Elder, was a pretty renowned engraver. And even Crispin's sister, Magdalena, produced some of her own works and actually had them under her name. Thank you for that. But something really cool about these that I don't think even our curatorial department knew. So these 2 prints belong to a book called De Bloemhof or Hortus Floridus. Hortus Floridus. There we go. And so that essentially means the flower garden. And Crispin was about 25 when he published this work. The first time it had a couple iterations. And this is a coloring book. It's one of the first coloring books in history. So it was actually printed just in black ink. And then the first 20 pages of the book gave you instructions on how to color in these works. So both of these works were not colored by the artist, the engraver, the publisher. They were colored in by whoever owned them. So this book was essentially a garden book set up in 4 seasons with a layout for a French-style garden for each of those 4 seasons. And I imagine it a lot like a modern seed catalog or a Better Homes and Gardens book that you would sit with in the dark, damp Dutch winter, and you're just planning your garden for the year and coloring in these blooms, imagining them blooming in real life. So very cool that this is a coloring book. And in this print in particular, there are several animals hidden. And I want to hit on that first because in this Dutch Golden Age, several different things happened that sort of spawned the rest of these works. So you have the Low Countries that become the Netherlands. They are no longer under Spanish rule, so they're no longer under Catholic rule. There's a Protestant Reformation. There are advancements in lens crafting and shipbuilding. So with advancements in lens crafting, microscopes are getting better, and we're looking at smaller and smaller things and imagining these tiny worlds, and there grows this fascination with tiny little things. At this time, people thought insects just came out of the ground, just spontaneously. So there were a lot of things we didn't know about nature, and there was a lot of fear in the Western world of nature and an unfamiliarity with it. So as we start looking more into it, and also with this Protestant Reformation and now the Low Countries gaining their own national identity, they start looking to flower painting as a way to kind of illustrate their ideas of individualism and self-determination and scientific inquiry and trying to connect with God, in a sense. So a lot of these works are, even if they're for a scientific purpose, they're kind of getting at that point a little bit. So advancements in shipbuilding, we get the Dutch East India Company, right? And everybody knows about Dutch East India Company, one of the world's first corporations, birth of capitalism, right? So these three works were part of a book called Hortus Malabaricus, okay? So that's Garden of Malabar. It was essentially supervised by Henrik Adrian van Reede, and he was the Dutch governor of Malabar, which is southwestern coast of India. Something the Dutch East India Company wanted its people to do: publish scientific works, right? We want you to study things, and we want you to publish them because they could be used for medicine, they could be used for bettering our society, or they could make us money. So let's publish them, let's learn about the world around us. And when Van Reede went to what's now India, they're deeply entrenched in the caste system, right? So he first goes to these Brahmin priests, and these are, the doctors, and he says, "Tell me about plants." And then they turn to field hand, and they ask the field hand to tell them about plants, and then they go to Van Reede, and they tell him about the plants. So he very quickly realizes that the core of knowledge, the core of botanical and herbal knowledge, is not in the top of this caste system. It's actually in the bottom, in the untouchable part of the caste system. So he's eventually put in touch with an herbal healer named Edie Achadan. We'll accept that pronunciation, who knows? And so Edie, because he's in this low, untouchable caste, his station is inherited. His job is inherited. So his father was an herbal healer. He's an herbal healer. Grandfather's an herbal healer. And all of this information is passed down on palm leaf manuscripts, okay? So Edie has the knowledge in his head, but he also has lots of years of knowledge to look back onto in these palm leaf manuscripts. And so for the next 30 years, Edie is set on on producing this book under Van Reede. And so a lot of different scholars were a part of this. A lot of different artists and draftsmen and engravers were a part of this. And they created a very formalized style, so all the plates would look the same in the book. And there seems to be some evidence that Edie was even brought to Amsterdam at some point, which is incredible at that time. And so this book is, the core of knowledge was in a language called Malayalam. We'll accept that too. And it would be dictated into, from Malayalam into Dutch and then translated into Latin for the publishing. And so this book has been in Latin for the past however many hundred years. And a Malayalam scholar, you would call that Malalali, but an Indian scholar has spent the last 30 years of his career retranslating that back into Malayalam. So this information that was lost to this culture is kind of brought back. But very, very cool. If you get up close to these, you can see that they have a Latin name, they have the Malayalam name, Arabic, and the Brahmin, which was the high priest caste. So they carry that name on it. Very interesting stuff. Okay, so we're going to start moving this way. Real quick first stop. These two prints by Abraham Munting. He was a Dutch botanist and pretty popular, I think. But he liked to illustrate his plants against these different scenes, often pastoral scenes. Here there's some sort of like city or fort or something against the ocean. And there are some people standing at the gate waving at the viewer of this. And he often, even though he was a botanist, he would sort of exaggerate or stylize different parts of the plants. So these are not taxonomically correct, but they're interesting nonetheless. And I think because of all the extra elements, they were more popular with the public. As we move this way, so Edie's, his notes that were passed down were so good that, and it seems that his culture had started to see the true taxonomic, the true scientific relationships between the plants, how they evolved together. And so as Carl Linnaeus came up with our modern system of classification, everybody knows what's our species name? Everybody know our species name? Homo sapiens, right? So Homo is our genus and sapiens is our species name. So that's a scientific, we call that binomial nomenclature. Okay, so you use two names to make this name. That came from Carl Linnaeus, and he also borrowed a lot from Edie's work in Hortus malabaricus for the Asian plants that he was working on. But before that, there were a lot of different ways to name plants, and there were a lot of arguments about which way we would do things. So before the binomial, the two-name nomenclature, you often get several names, like 4 or 5 or 6 different names together, and they're describing something. So this one is Onanthera folius lanceolatus dentatus calle hispido, and that's a long name to remember. So now it's just Onanthera and then whatever the last name is. So several of those here. Also, several of the prints I selected along this wall have representatives either in the conservatory or on our hiking trails or maybe in your gardens at home. So a lot of these can be grown here. Both of these really beautiful flowers here, incredibly detailed. Both of these belong to the acanthus family, Acanthaceae. We have a lot of examples of acanthus family plants in the conservatory. They're often the plants that are always in bloom, or if they're not always in bloom, they will always bloom at the same time every year, and they bloom really well. So if you're familiar with our golden shrimp plant, anyone familiar with that one? That one is in this family, and you can really see the relationship there. So our golden shrimp plant, this entire spike is yellow, and then where you have red flowers here, we have white flowers. So just kind of neat to know that the yellow part of that is not actually a flower, it's a modified leaf. So these two works here, these come from the Temple of Flora. Anyone ever heard of that? Artistically, it's an incredible piece of work. Dr. Robert Thornton, who put this together, he actually went bankrupt late in life because of this book. He spared no expense trying to get as many artists from Britain involved in the creation. Lots of different engravers, but he did not employ people who were botanically trained. So there are lots of mistakes. And what he was trying to do with this book that illustrates several different families of plants based on, let me back up here. He wanted to publish Carl Linnaeus' stuff, essentially. He wanted to turn it into this artistic masterpiece. He really liked what Carl Linnaeus was doing, and this is at that time that we're starting to adopt that scientific binomial nomenclature, okay? And with plants, I was telling our docents before, and I had a live plant and was showing them some things. Often with plants, we group them into their families based on their reproductive structures, so how their flowers are shaped and how their fruits form, which I was just talking about that here. So in this book, he published examples of different families and kind of had a characteristic representative for that. He also wanted to place them in the context of their native habitat, which if you see all of these, they're just on essentially a blank piece of paper, right? It's the one plant and that's it. He's wanting to kind of show this ecological relationship even before we had that word ecology. But he also failed at that because, again, remember, he didn't hire botanical experts. So I was just reading last night about these two prints, and in this one, there's a pagoda, a very nondescript pagoda, and this is, it's titled Indian Reed. So this is a canna indica, and cannas are from the New World, they're from the Americas. It was called indica or Indian reed because of the West Indies and the East Indies, that whole confusion. So when he spared all of this expense to create this print, he did not apparently seem to understand that this is not from India or China. This is from the New World. So, wrong, right? This one is just as bad. So this is the maggot-bearing Stapelia. They're in the milkweed family. If you have milkweed at home for your monarchs, this is the family. And the maggot-bearing Stapelia has this really awful smells like roadkill flower. It looks like a pig's backside when you see it in person. It's got all these hairs on it and looks like flesh, smells like a pig's backside. And so again, he wanted to put it in the context of its native environment. But very quickly when I was looking at this print, I'm thinking there are conifers that are characteristic of Europe in this print. There's a river running through it and all these mountains, and this looks like Europe, right? Any kind of, mountainous scene in Europe. And this plant actually comes from very arid regions of Africa. So there may be mountains and there may be rocks and things in the picture, but probably are not going to have these conifers, probably not going to have this raging river running through. So I don't think that it's very accurate in that sense, but we do have a fly landing on here to do the pollination. And hidden out of view almost is a green mamba, which is native to Africa. So there's a green mamba in here, and I think maybe the snake-like look of the plant, he decided to put an African snake in there. I don't know. But again, this one's wrong. Okay. Robert Thornton over here is kind of drawing influence from people like Mark Catesby. So Mark Catesby, and I've called him America's first naturalist here. He was born in the UK, died in the UK, so maybe not America's first naturalist, but his sister married a doctor in Williamsburg, Virginia. And so he follows her to Williamsburg to escort her to her husband. And then he spends a while traveling around the colonies and goes back to the UK. And while he was traveling, he did all of these wonderful illustrations. And he gets back to the UK, gets back to London, and people are going nuts over it. So they decide, he finds some backers, and they send him back to the colonies. And there he spends a while going through the South and goes to the Caribbean and Bermuda and the Bahamas, and then back to the UK. Before he got started, he was not an artist. This is just something he was doing just to kind of pass time, basically, while he was traveling around. And then his compositions really, resounded with people. So he started to pursue this career. He became an engraver, so he could engrave his own things. He learned the whole printing process so that he could take care of that. He really wanted the colors to be as true as possible. And often in the printing process, you would have someone do the painting. Someone would make an engraving from that painting. Another person would do the printing. And so on. So over time, you may end up with colors that are not true to life. So he wanted to kind of control as much of that process as he could. To save money, he would often group things together on a work. And sometimes it doesn't make sense when he groups something together, like this. So this is a plant called Spigelia. And no, it does not have foot-long red flowers. I don't know why it's so out of scale with this gray fox. And I imagine these two are probably from his first trip to the Americas. And this one may have also been in that first trip to the Americas. But I think this improvement here of these three shows his second trip. And I can back that up that these are all plants that he would have encountered in the South and in the Caribbean. So this one in particular and this one. This is the manchineel tree. This is one of the most poisonous plants on earth. And it's so poisonous, it grows in the Caribbean. It's so poisonous that you'll see signs on beaches in the Caribbean that say, do not stand under this tree in a rainstorm, because the water will pick up the sap, and as it rains down on you, you'll get chemical burns or dermatitis. So very poisonous tree. I'm really curious how he got this little sample to do. Did he have a reaction from this? I don't know. In this one, he has a snake wrapped around a root. I read a story that was similar to this print, or refers to a print very similar to this one. That one had a sweet potato, and a snake was wrapped around a sweet potato. And in his notes about it, he was talking with plantation workers, and they said, well, we're digging in these fields, in these sweet potato fields, and we always find these snakes. So he thought, okay, well, maybe the sweet potatoes are attracting the snakes. So he's trying to say that there's some sort of observation, some relationship he has observed here. This is a trumpet vine, which is native in this area, and we have a ruby-throated hummingbird that's, pollinating it, getting nectar from it. Different butterflies that he may have seen interacting with the plants. So he starts to lean into these ecological relationships in his compositions. And this ultimately influences Dr. Robert Thornton. It influences Audubon, who directly references him. And Audubon sort of repeats many of the compositions that he did. But the difference between Audubon, who came later, and Mark Catesby, Audubon almost always worked from dead specimens. So even though his birds are very well rendered, they often look lifeless. And while this one is not a great example, the little hummingbird, Catesby often has a bit more of a liveliness going on because he's using real living examples. He also sent a lot of samples back to the UK. And there's a story of him, he liked to send snakes. He liked snakes. So he would pickle snakes in bottles of rum and ship them back. But they wouldn't make it to London because the sailors would throw out the snake and drink the bottle of rum. So he's pretty interesting. 4 works by Gerard van Speendonck, who was a Dutch artist. And then there are 4 here by Pierre-Joseph Rideau. Gerard, he was his teacher. Speendonck really takes the Dutch school of floral painting, if you think of like Van Huysum and Rachel Ruysch, if I'm pronouncing that correct. He's very influenced by them, studied under them, that sort of thing, and tries to exemplify their style. He gets a job in Paris as a professor of flower painting, and in this job, he has to produce 20 vellums, so really high-quality paper, 20 vellums for the king's vellums, each year. And then he can do whatever else he wants. And so prior to that, all of the people who had been in that station before would they would work on the vellum, but they would use gouache, which is a like opaque watercolor, right? Speendonck starts using actual watercolor, which has a bit more of a luminosity to it. It allows the brightness of the paper to show through. And so Gerard starts to develop this, they become a little more lifelike, a little more, they sort of come off of the paper a little bit. He also starts using an engraving technique called stippling, which is where you're making tiny dots. Most of the works you see along that wall are going to use line engraving. So they're putting long lines into the copper plate or the metal plate that they're going to print with. And that's for botanical illustration, that's a big change in things. The line engraving kind of makes things harsher, bolder. It's a little harder to render high detail. The stippling allows you to be very fine, very precise, and very soft. So he teaches this stuff to Rideau, and Rideau also studies under some actual botanists so that he can learn what's needed for the scientific study of these plants. Rideau ends up working for Marie Antoinette and Empress Josephine. So he gets a lot of money and is allowed to paint as much as he wants to. He's been nicknamed the Raphael of flowers because his works are just incredible. But he And he did not create this himself. He got credit for it. He even won a lawsuit for it, but it was a technique already being used. La poupée, where's Liz? Am I saying that right? The technique? So you would yeah, there you go. So he would apply several colors to the metal plate that was going to print. He would apply several at once. So you get a nice soft blending, and it creates just a more lifelike work. So I really encourage you all, the two on the other side plus these two, compare them back and forth to that and see if you can see the similarities and the differences and how they affect the rendering. All right. So all of this is going on. And we also have the British during the Victorian period. They become obsessed with ferns and orchids, right? So there was pteridimania, which pteridophytes are ferns. So pteridimania and orchid delirium. And there's a lot of interesting things, a lot of really beautiful orchids that have been illustrated. And a lot of this movement from the French court with Rideau and this obsession with ferns and orchids and other botanical interests, this really starts to influence later on Art Nouveau, and then that starts to influence several different movements within the last 100 years. And even today, you can go into Target and get botanical prints that probably have Spendong's name on them. So this really sets the tone for the next, 150 years or more. So at this time, as people are really obsessed with orchids and ferns and are building greenhouses so they could grow these exotic plants in cold, dark Britain, they start publishing magazines, quarterly, monthly magazines, where lots of different things that are being found and described from all around the world are being published. And this one in particular, you probably saw the come join me for the talk, right? And I'm having standing with an orchid in front of this one. They're not the same orchid. This one is an actual species, and the one that I'm standing with is a hybrid that's made from several different species. But they do look similar, and I think Dr. Mike may have selected that plant in the past because of this print. But this one is an orchid that at this time is called Odontoglossum lindleyanum. And Odontoglossum is the genus, remember, Homo, and lindleyanum is the species name, like our sapiens. And lindleyanum means, Lindley is a prominent orchidologist, a prominent person studying orchids in the UK, and anum means year, right? So essentially, this is called Old Man Lindley's Odontoglossum. The person who described this orchid as a new species is a German named Gustav Heinrich Reichenbach, and we're going to talk about him a little bit and something else down here. But Gustav was kind of, I'm just going to say it, he's a little bit of an asshole. He loved to describe species just for the merit of describing a new species. I mean, who doesn't, as a scientist, want to describe a new species? And so Lindley, John Lindley, again, the prominent orchidologist in the UK, he looked at an herbarium specimen, a dried, pressed specimen of this orchid, and he said, it's just another example of a species we've already described. And then later on, Reichenbach looks at it and he says, oh no, he's wrong. Those Brits don't know what they're doing. They're really awful at collecting. They're barbarians. And I, a German, am going to name this after him, to kind of stick it to him. And so I think he was really trying to say, he's so old and feeble, we'll just give this orchid to him. So moving on. These two prints here, and these are the ones I'm going to end on, and I'll take the whole rest of the time for this. So these are by John Gould, who is a British ornithologist, really well known. If you like bird prints, you probably have a reproduction of his. And he did a few different books. One of them was on Himalayan birds. He had one on hummingbirds, and he had one on toucans. And the toucans came before the hummingbirds. So he did an edition of the toucans in, I believe, the 1830s, and then he redoes it and has all of the works re-illustrated and includes several new species in the early 1850s, 52, 53. Okay? Something else, a couple other really cool things to know about John Gould. The theory of evolution probably would not have congealed without him. So Darwin did not realize that the finches he was looking at in the Galapagos were finches. He just thought they were different types of birds. And that's kind of the critical part of, the theory of evolution, is that this one thing goes and then it speciates and becomes several other things. So his samples come back to London, and John Gould looks at them and says, these are all finches. They're all really weird looking finches, but they're all finches. And so that sort of helps him out quite a bit. With several of these artists whose names are on the walls, it was actually their wives doing the illustrations. So John Lindley, some of his illustrations that he would do were done by his wife. John Gould would do a sketch, and then he would pass that to an illustrator, and it was his wife Elizabeth until she died of in childbirth, not of childbirth. And then he moved on to some other illustrators after that. I believe Henry Constantine Richter did these two. He also was friends, he and Elizabeth, his wife, were friends with Edward Lear, and Edward Lear would do some of these illustrations and the engravings. Edward Lear, the guy who popularized the limerick. So for a period, they all three lived together, and I imagine that was an interesting household.
So what's the time period?
So this is 1840s into the 1860s here. And over here we started in the 1500s, 1600s, and pretty much have moved that time there. Okay. When I got the opportunity to put this exhibition together with the curatorial department, thank you guys so much for that, I wanted to select a plant to add to the collection based on this exhibition. My predecessor, Dr. Mike, had done that several times, and that's, I think, like I said, how we got that orchid. This first print over here, when I was talking about Edie, the guy from India, I purchased a plant from one of those prints. But as I was selecting the prints, this one really stood out to me. I mean, it's gorgeous, right? Really bold, really contrasting, great colors, great condition. And these toucans are just so impressive. And John, our curator, said, you can choose some prints that have animals in them. They don't all have to be plants. But I love this orchid, and most people don't even notice this orchid. If you get up close to it, the orchid has the same red and the same yellow that these toucans have. These toucans, by the way, are called collared acari. And these are two males. They're not a male and a female. The two males here, which is kind of unusual. Usually you would illustrate a male and a female bird together to see the sexual dimorphism. So he did a great job at picking out this orchid because it goes with these toucans so well. Okay, so we're going to talk about this orchid for a little bit, and it's going to get crazy, okay? I have visual aids. Let's do this. So, again, I wanted to pick out a plant, wanted to find a plant and get it for the collection, and I thought, how great would it be to have this orchid blooming and show it to you all? Unfortunately, I was not able to find this exact one, and we will find out why. So, at first when I set out to figure out what this was, I thought, surely I can look at the text that accompanies this print, and it will just say what the orchid is. And so I set out to do that, and I couldn't find the text. I couldn't find a source for the text. So, and I'm sure someone in curatorial probably could have, but I was doing this on my own. And so I thought, I'm a botanist. I'm trained to ID plants. I can figure this out. And then I got into a big hornet's nest and went down a deep rabbit hole, and now we're here talking about this orchid. So I pretty quickly figured out that this orchid probably belongs to the genus Maxillaria. And Maxillaria is called Maxillaria because there's a section of the orchid that sort of juts out like your upper jawbone. Not on us, but if you think of like a dog or a horse, their upper jawbone is protruding outward. So pretty quickly narrowed it down to the genus Maxillaria. And in the genus Maxillaria, there's somewhere between 300 and 600 species. And there's a gap that, there's that big difference because Mr. Reichenbach over there liked to describe a lot of orchids. Other people like to describe orchids. So there's a lot of orchids that maybe these aren't the same species, maybe they are, maybe this one's been described multiple times, maybe it's never been described at all. And maybe the variation that we're seeing here are two different orchids, or maybe they're the same. So, start looking for an orchid. I think I figured out what this one was. I was pretty sure about it. I purchased it. It came. It was in bloom. We got to see the orchid. It smelled fantastic. I thought it was the species Maxillaria dillonii, which is so fitting because my partner's name is Dylan, and I was like, that's nice. That's cute. But eventually, after a little bit of poking around and whatnot, I started to feel less confident that that was the orchid. And in my poking around, I found sources that ultimately led me to the original text that accompanies this. And wouldn't you know, at the bottom of the text, as he's describing these toucans and their biology and whatnot, at the bottom of it, it says, the pretty little orchid in the frame is Maxillaria leptosepala. Okay, great. Google Maxillaria leptosepala, let's order it, let's buy it, let's bring it in. I can't find it, okay? I can't find this orchid anywhere. So I do a lot of deep digging, get into this deep rabbit hole, and I eventually find where Maxillaria leptosepala is described for the first time. So the same person who illustrated these two here did this illustration, and this was published in 1849. So this is Maxillaria leptosepala, and in the description in Curtis Botanical Magazine, it says this orchid was collected by Mr. William Purdy in 1849 in New Granada, which is the countries that would become Venezuela and Colombia. And he ships it to the UK, he ships it to London, it goes to Kew Royal Botanic Garden, and it blooms for the first time in July of 1849. Later that year, it's published with this illustration, and this species comes into existence in the scientific literature. Then it starts to disappear from there, and there's a couple times that it pops up, and it's on a few herbarium sheets here and there, but overall, the orchid kind of disappears from our knowledge, with the exception of this one. So in 1852-53, a few years after this orchid was published, Gold uses it in his illustration of these toucans, okay? And then in 1861, he publishes his book on hummingbirds, and he uses the same orchid again. And I'm going to pass this around. There's several, we're going to talk about several things that I'm going to pass around, but feel free to look at this and compare them to this one, because I believe that whoever was illustrating this for John Gold directly used the original Walter Hood Fitch illustration, copied it essentially with a few changes here, and then uses it again for his book in 1861. Okay, so I thought, well, maybe this orchid has just changed names. Maybe we've forgotten about it, and maybe at some point it's come back into existence under another name. Am I losing everybody yet? Okay. So then I find Maxillaria satigera, okay? And this is an herbarium sheet. It's a really unusual herbarium sheet, but this one is an herbarium sheet made by John Lindley, the guy that this orchid is named after. And in it, there's an illustration down in the corner here, but there's no other plant material. And there's a note on this herbarium sheet. It says, type of Maxillaria satigera. Lindley only saw a single flower when he described the species, which was apparently used for the painting here. The floral remnants were apparently not pressed. So if they were pressed, they probably got lost at some point. So all we have is, to describe this species, is the painting of one flower. He didn't even see the plant. The flower was given to him, and he painted it. And then later in Kew's records, they have a Maxillaria leptosepala painting that was painted by Miss Janet Ross, and it was she did the painting of an orchid in her husband's collection. And this one's from 1883, and I'm not convinced it's Maxillaria leptosepala. I think it's Maxillaria satigera. And currently, the American Orchid Society, which is a scientific they are scientific, but I think they're more horticulturally minded. They consider Satidra and Leptocephalus synonymous. They're saying these are the same species. So one authority says these are the same species, okay? I disagree. All right. Next, we get Maxillaria andrezii, suspect number 2, okay? And here are 2 of the most impressive herbarium sheets I've ever seen. I worked in an herbarium for a while. Do you guys know we have an herbarium in town? Anyone here know that? There's an herbarium at Marshall with 50,000 specimens, okay? 50,000 specimens. If you don't know about it, you need to know about it. It's incredible. And herbaria are shutting down all around the world. Duke just closed their herbarium of, I believe, 800,000 specimens, one of the largest herbaria in the country. So go support your local herbarium. So this one is Maxillaria andrezii, okay? And what we're going to look at in this one as I pass it around. So andrezii was described by Reichenbach, the asshole, right? Okay? Sorry. I've read a lot of his notes. I've read a lot of letters. He would also publish a lot in Germany, the area that became Germany. Often during this period was sort of the go-between between the West and Russia, scientifically. So often Germans would publish in Russian journals, and they would publish bilingually. Everything would be in German and Russian together. And then they might also publish in English journals, but the Russians didn't really publish in English journals and vice versa. So I've read a lot of his things where he's making fun of the British and the Americans, and he just doesn't seem like a nice guy. Something else, he's also not a good scientist, because in science you want everything to be shared, right? You want to share your information, share your data, so that other people can repeat your experiments, repeat your observations, and confirm that what you're saying is scientifically true is actually true. So Reichenbach had his own personal herbarium, which was pretty common for these guys at this time. And upon his death, he had in his will that for 20 years, it was either 20 or 25, but I think it was 20. For 20 years, my herbarium is to be kept under lock and key, and no one is allowed into it. And so what that means is everything that he's holding there is not available for any other scientist for 20 years. So none of his contemporaries can kind of check his work, right? And there are many, many species being described out of his herbarium, including Maxillaria andrezii. So this is the type specimen, just like the one of Satidra is the type specimen. What does that mean, a type specimen? A type specimen means this is the one that we describe this species from. And when we compare this to other, if we're looking at different species and we're trying to figure out, is it this, is it that, or whatever, we're always going to go back to this very first one that is the most typical of this species, okay? So this is the type species, this one here, or the type specimen for Maxillaria andrezii. And in it, there's a really sloppy handwritten note that only about half of it has been transcribed because nobody can read the other half, where he's talking about receiving this orchid and describing it and what it looked like, that sort of thing. There is a drawing, hand-colored with very minimal coloring, a hand-colored drawing in one corner, another drawing down here, and there's an actual piece of one of the blooms from the plant here. And then a duplicate specimen is made, because if you make something, you want to be able to share it, and you want it to last, and so you make 2 of them, right? So he sends another one, or he makes another one to be sent elsewhere. And it also contains a tracing of these drawings, but in it, there's also a tracing of the flower that's here. So that's kind of cool that they hold the same information. This is an old school Xerox copy, Xerox, there we go. It's a copy. The second one here, I'm going to pass it off. The second one, so first the specimens are sent to Vienna after his death, or after his herbarium's been opened up. They're sent to Vienna, and then a researcher starts looking at them, and he takes the second specimen to Berlin. Well, what happens in Europe in the early 1900s? So a lot of specimens get destroyed, but luckily the researcher who took it to Berlin sold it to the Harvard herbarium. And so that specimen now lives in Harvard. And by the way, I was doing all this on my phone, just looking at specimens I wanted to pull up and blow up. And so there's some cool stuff there. So Andrésii, I want to talk about that real quick, just to nail home how bad Reichenbach was. So these are, he names this orchid Andrésii after August Andrés, who was his collector working in the New World, his collector working in Panama, Venezuela, Colombia, Ecuador, that area. And so Andrés says, Reichenbach has lately repeated his proposal of buying my dried orchid collections, and I fear our first interview will be a stormy one. I begin to consider these cabinet celebrities as vampires nourishing their inflated fame at the cost of the lifeblood of those poor fools they condescendingly call collectors. So he's the collector, and the cabinet celebrity is Reichenbach. And I am thoroughly disgusted at moments with the pursuits I have so passionately followed for 7 years. Reichenbach lately proposed retarding the publication of my plants to 1875 in order to adorn, as he says, the catalog with which will be published on the occasion of the anniversary of the Hamburg Botanic Gardens, of which he is the director. My opinion is that if any further retardation takes place, it will emanate from a resolution of relinquishing his invaluable cooperation and of working up the material myself and by myself. Would that I had done this, man, they write so funny, right? Would that I had done this long ago. I should then at least have enjoyed the public credit, which is my just due and reward for the sacrifices I have made, if by sheer luck, not worn out bodily, my patience is at least exhausted. Okay? And just to kind of, so Andrés dies, okay? And then in 1886, Reichenbach publishes this new species, and he says, this flowered in 1870 in the Hamburg Botanic Garden, having been sent alive with Sievkingia, I think that might be some other plant, by the late Mr. Andrés, to whose memory it is now dedicated. I made a sketch of colors, but never published it. Now it has reappeared also from Costa Rica in the establishment of Messrs. Hugh, Lowe, and Son, whence it had been kindly sent me by Mr. Edward Lowe. So this orchid reappears. Part of it is sent to Reichenbach for examination, and he realizes, oh yeah, Andrés had sent me this one, and I described it, but I conveniently forgot to publish it. And remember, he didn't want to publish any of Andrés's orchids. Okay, so that's suspect number 2. Suspect number 3, our final suspect. Okay, everybody with me still? All right, Maxillaria caroli. Okay, so Maxillaria caroli is officially described as a species, I believe, in 2002 by Eric Christensen, who was a PhD working on neotropical orchids in the tropics of the Americas. And it had already been published under another name. It was published under Maxillaria satigera. Remember, we were already looking at satigera. Variety caroli by Irene Bach in 1984. So Irene Bach is a German lady, German orchid enthusiast, who I believe traveled with her husband. Was it Costa? Where did we look at this at? I forget where exactly. In Colombia. They were in Colombia, and they find this orchid, and she names it after him in thanks for supporting her trips, right? And but she just names it Maxillaria satigera variety caroli. So she's saying, I think that this orchid is the same as satigera, but it's slightly different. And so I'm just going to, it's a different variety. And then again, Eric Christensen elevated it to a species level in 2002. So the original article, I read Eric's article, but the original article for Maxillaria satigera variety caroli is in the German orchid catalog, the German orchid magazine, Die Orchideen, I believe that's how it's said. And it's all in German, and I could not find a PDF, even in German. I couldn't find a copy of this anywhere. So one day I just decided, I'm just going to email the magazine. And I said, hey, can I get this article? And I provide them the stuff. And the next morning, I get an email from Irene Bach. And she sends me a PDF of her article in German. And so I was like, while I have you on the line, let me ask some questions. What do you think about all this stuff? And she says, well, yeah, I think you might be right, that this one could be the Maxillaria leptosepala, this guy, right? They look identical. It seems to make sense. Andresii looks really identical too. So these two are good candidates. These are really good candidates for it. So I'm going to pass this one around if you want to look at it. So just out of curiosity, I thought, well, let me look around for Maxillaria caroli. Can I find that one? And I couldn't find any source of it for sale right now. They were all apparently out of stock. But I was seeing photos of it in different parts of the world. It seems like this name hasn't quite caught on yet, if this is the accurate name. But I did see a photo of Maxillaria caroli, a big, beautiful specimen, at Kew Royal Botanic Garden. And orchids are very long-lived. If you can care for them, if you take care of them, they last a long time. We have orchids in our collection that are definitely more than 30 years old. There are some hybrids in there that could possibly go all the way back to the Victorian period if that lineage has been kept up and it's not a remade hybrid. So I thought, how cool would it be if we could maybe get this orchid from Kew, get a propagation of it, right? So as I'm looking at this photo, I realized I follow the person who posted this. And so I reach out to him, and his name's Alberto, and he's currently, I think, conservatory director at the Birmingham Botanic Garden in the UK. But he used to work for Kew just a couple years ago. So I reach out, and I'm like, hey, what do you know about this orchid? What can you tell me? And he said, well, it's definitely not that one. It's not that exact one, because all of the orchids or most of the orchid collection at Kew was lost during the 1800s a couple different times. So at one point, their heating failed and everything froze. Another time, protesters with the women's suffragette movement broke into the glass houses and set fire to all the orchids. So that orchid no longer exists. But there is a beautiful specimen of caroli in their holding now in their collections. And I found out, so back up a little bit, Kew leaves the American orchids to the Americans, and most of their orchid collection is actually Asian and African orchids. They leave the rest to us. But they have a huge collection of Maxillaria, and it's because one man in the UK really, really liked them, collected them. I believe he was an ophthalmologist like Dr. Korstanje, and if I remember correctly. And upon his death, he donated this genus collection of Maxillaria to Kew. So now they have this national collection of the genus. And so that's where that orchid came from. So we don't know where it is now. But there's one more element to the story, and then I'll let you guys go. Okay? Did we make it through everything so far? Okay. So I thought, well, wouldn't it be great if I could find some DNA papers, find some genetic evidence of, are these the same species? Are they different? Blah, blah, blah. And I did find a couple articles, a couple journal articles where some studies have been done to understand this genus better. And one of them from 2007 actually has all of these suspects in it. And they're placed very closely together, so close that they could be the same species, just different regional varieties. Maybe they are different species, the Cetidra, caroli, and Andresii. But one of these is going to be synonymous with our Maxillaria leptosepala. So it's one of these three here. And I looked at the lead author on that paper, and it was a guy named Dr. Mark Whitten. So Mark Whitten passed away, I think, in 2020. And he was another prominent neotropical orchid researcher. Did a lot of work in Costa Rica and Venezuela, I think, and Colombia, whatnot. He also was Dr. Mike Beck my predecessor, he was his roommate in college. And when Dr. Mike came to the museum and started working as conservatory director here, Dr. Witten sent a whole slew of orchids. And one of the orchids he sent, he had collected off a mountain in Costa Rica. And that orchid still exists here in the collection. And it's one of the most floriferous ones. It's very fragrant. I show it off all the time. Everybody calls it the licorice orchid, but in one of the camps this year, the kids said that it smelled like pepperoni. So apparently it's the pepperoni orchid. But so this whole long story of, I just wanted to get an orchid, and then it opened up a whole can of worms and also showed some connections that this collection already had to the museum that we weren't aware of. So that's my whole talk there. I hope I didn't bore you too much. But thank you guys. Woo! It's a lot of talking.